let's proceed with Professor Kristina Olson talk, who is the current president of the American Boccaccio Association and an associate professor of Italian at George Mason University, where she has taught Italian language, literature, and cinema since 2005. Uh, Her monograph is Courtesy Lost, Dante, Boccaccio, and the Literature of History, edited in 2014. She's authored several articles on Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch, and she is the co-editor, among other books, of Approaches to Teaching Dante's Divine Comedy with the Modern Language Association, which is out this year and will be no doubt very useful to many who will have Dante in the anniversary. Her talk today is entitled Costor non saranno, dalla morte, vinti. Boccaccio's strategy of invincibility on the Decameron. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this event. I wanted to thank you and, of course, Luigi Troiani and for your wonderful organization of the event, and to also thank Antonio for all of the technical assistance. I'm looking forward. I'm so impressed by the long list of events that you are sponsoring there at the Center for Italian Studies at Stony Brook, and I'm looking forward to the 2021 Dante event. I'm looking forward to the Carlo Levi exhibit. Sounds fascinating. And so I'm very pleased to learn about all of this in these very difficult times. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me a moment. And I hope that everyone can see this PowerPoint. Is everything okay? Good, thank you. Okay, wonderful. I also just wanted to add what an honor it is to follow Professor Cardini, of whose work I am a great fan, wonderful work of whose work I would say I'm an admirer. And specifically his point about the fear of death, I think is going to be an interesting juxtaposition to what I'm going to be talking about today. Oh, 1 second, I'm trying to change my slide. Okay, here we go. So at the beginning of the 9th day of the Decameron, the queen of the day, Emilia, leads her fellow members of the brigata into a nearby forest where they have a unique encounter with nature. As the text reads on your screen, on entering the wood, they observed a number of roebucks, stags, and other wild creatures, which, as though sensing they were safe from the hunter on account of the plague, stood their ground as if they had been rendered tame and fearless. This excerpt from day 9 recalls the abundance of recent accounts of the unique boldness and presence of animals among us, not only those who have been spotted in nature, but those who have fearlessly entered cities. You might recall, for instance, the appearance of 120 Kashmiri goats in Wales who descended from the Great Orme into the town of, and I can't pronounce this is Welsh, Llandudno, in this year, 2020 in March. The herd of goats decided to romp through the streets, or so it is understood, because of the lockdown, nibbling on bushes and flowers. Or you might have thought of the family of boars recently seen wandering through the streets of Rome, to the fear or delight, as we see here, of many of its residents. Or even the sight of dolphins in the canals of Venice, whose waters now run clear, free of the sediment churned up by motorized boats. Such marvels of the natural world, emboldened by the diminished presence of humans, have been read as the miracles of the pandemic. The brigata's encounter with animals in the Decameron is a purposeful reference by Boccaccio. Emboldened by the absence of hunters, these animals serve as a reflection of the Decameron's brigata, the 10 Florentine storytellers. Like the animals, described as being senza tema o domestici, without fear or domesticated, the 7 women and 3 men of the brigata also have achieved an appearance of invincibility and fearlessness. Wreathed with fronds and holding herbs and flowers in their hands, the brigata would inspire someone to say that they will not be vanquished by death, or that they will meet death happily. O Costor non saranno dalla morte vinti, o ella gli ucciderà lieti. Either they will be invincible, the author tells us, or they will be fearless, happy even in the face of death. How does the brigata gain this sense of invincibility? And how did they lose their fear of death? Their decision to leave a plague-infested Florence was inspired, as we learn in the introduction to day one, by the desire to preserve their lives from a contagion that spread like fire throughout the city. At the beginning of the penultimate day of the Decameron, then, the brigata has achieved this enlightened state. Is it because of the selection of themes for each day of storytelling, highlighting as they do the power of ingenio, of intellect, against the forces of fortune and love? Have they been edified by the parade of virtues and vices and their costs and benefits within their tales? Or is it simply the time spent away from the plague-ravaged city of Florence, a total of 2 weeks in the countryside, that has enabled them to cultivate this resistance to fear, this defiance in the face of death? So in my talk today, I consider the few references to the plague in the frame narrative and the Cento Novelle. Then, departing from Boccaccio's source text, in Paul the Deacon's History of the Lombards, I examine references to the houses of the dead, the Casa dei Morti, as well as the sexualized metaphors related to the afterlife that we find in day 3 of the Decameron. Especially in the third day of storytelling, the Decameron creates the topography of this world to comprise the world beyond, thereby erasing the boundaries between life and death. In these ways, I'd argue, the brigata develops a sense of invincibility that enables them to return to a Florence still stricken with the plague. They create a narrative strategy for pandemic life. So references to the plague, to the apparent surprise, excuse me, of first-time readers of the Decameron during the current COVID-19 crisis, I'd count many of my students among them, are few and far between in Boccaccio's vernacular opus. Consider, for example, that the lexicon for the word for plague, pestilenza, mortalità, and so forth, counts approximately only 15 occurrences in the entire Decameron. So for a work that's set against the backdrop of the bubonic plague in mid-14th century Florence, it may seem strange that there is only one reference to the Black Death itself outside of the frame narrative, that is, in the introductions to day 1 and day 9, and in the conclusion to day 10. At the end of the 10th day, Dioneo recalls the context of the plague, just in case anyone has forgotten it. Quote, "Tomorrow, as you know, a fortnight will have elapsed since the day we departed from Florence to provide for our relaxation, preserve our health and our lives, and escape from the sadness, the suffering, and the anguish continuously to be found in our city since the plague first descended upon it." And forgotten it they might have, given how little the brigata actually speaks of it. Two other brief references to the plague occur in 2 different tales. One can be found in the 3rd story of the 6th day, which features Monna Nonna dei Pulci, a young woman who died in middle age during, quote unquote, this present epidemic. Una giovane, la quale questa pestilenzia presente c'è tolta donna, il cui nome fu Monna Nonna del Pulci, cugina di Messer Alesso Rinucci. This almost parenthetical aside, in a work that includes over 100 tales, is noteworthy. We might ask, how is it possible that no other character was a fatality in the Black Death besides Monna Nonna, who appears in this extremely short tale to utter one pronta risposta? And isn't it strange, also considering the author's claim that over 100,000 Florentines died between only March and July of 1348? The other reference to the plague is not to the Black Death. It appears in the 8th tale of the second day. In this story, an outbreak of plague in Wales is described as a blessing of God, right? Not the damnation of God, not the punishment of God that we read about in the introduction to day 1. In this case, the son of the Count of Antwerp, who is named Louis, but called Perrot, Louis, but here he's called Perrot, he experiences an incredible turn of good fortune once the plague kills, quote, his master and mistress, their son, and several of his master's brothers, grandchildren, and other relatives, so that only a daughter of marriageable age survived, together with some members of the household, among them Perrot. So she marries Perrot, who in turn is named master of all the goods and property she had inherited. So he comes into the wealth vis-a-vis this marriage, right? And then to add to his good fortune, the King of England, who needs to replace Perrot's former master, the Marshal, appoints Perrot in his place. It would seem, outside of the frame, that the plague is not a disruptive force. Anzi, we would say, except for taking the life of the witty poor Monna Nonna dei Pulci, a pandemic can bring a great turn of fortune within the tales themselves. So why doesn't Boccaccio integrate more references to the Black Death in the stories themselves? No, Boccaccio probably did not suffer from pandemic fatigue, as we say now. Instead, the Decameron is much more preoccupied with other issues raised in its frame narrative, such as the status of the author writing a work in the vernacular that is dedicated to women. The Decameron is a galeotto for women in love, a go-between for women in love who are confined to their chambers, who work at their spindles, subject to the whims of their fathers, mothers, and brothers. Women who are deprived of the occasions for distraction, such as hunting, falconry, gambling, horse riding, and engaging in commerce, which are fields of activity reserved for men. These gendered spaces of domestic, mercantile, and royal worlds are the spaces that are crisscrossed by the hundreds of protagonists as they attempt to overcome misfortune, not the plague. In this light, we might observe that the plague, being insurmountable, is a narrative dead end. What would it mean anyhow to integrate more references to the plague in these tales? Wouldn't that weaken the stories? To add to the tenacious relationship of the plague to the Decameron, we still debate the originality of the extensive description of the plague that we do get in the introduction to day 1, for which the Decameron is often cited today. While the author insists that he saw it with his very own eyes, that is, the carnage that was wreaked by the plague in Florence, we of course do not know he himself bore witness to the plague. We do know that his stepmother died from it, and that his father, who died in 1349, was instrumental in the city's supply efforts during that time as the ufficiale dell'abbondanza, a provisions officer. So the descriptions given by the author of the measures taken to clean municipal refuse and to ban sick individuals from the city are details that he probably knew well. The improbable nature of a true eyewitness account is underlined by the strong influence upon these pages of Paul the Deacon's description of the plague of Justinian that ravaged Liguria around the early part of the 6th century AD, which appears in the second book of the history of the Lombards. Though his treatment of the plague is far more extensive, Boccaccio borrows wholesale many of its most heart-wrenching topoi from the typology of symptoms, which you can see here in this slide, the lethality of the plague, the abandonment of homes in the city and of the harvest in the countryside, and the abandonment of parents and children by each other respectively. And here in this slide, you would notice, if you're familiar with the introduction to Day One by Boccaccio, you'll know that there are many similarities here. For example, the size of the govocciolo, the growth, right? He likens to being either the size of an egg or an apple. Here we have a nut or a date. As well, Boccaccio includes a stipulation that if you were to survive through the third day, then you have a chance of living. It appears, unless this was medically correct, it appears that he could have gotten this from Paul the Deacon's account as well. So I'm not going to read through all of this text, but I wanted to share this with you so that you can get a sense of the similarities with Day One. And I've underlined here some parts of the text that refer to houses and dwellings that become abandoned by those escaping from the plague, because I'm going to be talking about this in a moment. So the other point of contact with my discussion today, specifically of the introduction to Day 9, and its reference, of course, to the bold animals, perhaps has a counterpart here in Paul the Deacon's reference to the fact that human habitations have become a place of refuge for wild beasts, right? So for all of these reasons, for the strong influence, right, of this account upon the introduction to the first day, I tend to read the introduction to Day One, and I am interested to hear your thoughts on this. I read this account of the plague as a dutiful, if traumatized, recollection of their pandemic context. Boccaccio's account serves as a pretext for the existence of a storytelling brigata that is forced to escape Florence. The description of the plague in the introduction to Day One is couched within the author's even more important prologue. And this account of the plague is cut short by the description of the formation of the brigata. The plague is simply the arduous mountain that must be climbed, as the author himself says. But one could also say that such an arduous mountain doesn't have to be present at all. Yet, the plague is essential in creating the circumstances that enable the storytelling to take place. As the prologue and the introduction establish, such a female-dominant brigata could never escape to the countryside to tell these kinds of tales without the dissolution of social morals described in the introduction to Day One, or the necessity of their flight from the city. Furthermore, the description of the plague necessarily sets the stage for the rebuilding of society and for the consideration of such tools of survival as ingenio and the dubious morality of deceptive acts. Pandemics, as Boccaccio knew well, create a moral vacuum that fosters imagination and rebirth. They are, like the tales themselves, utili, useful, to quote the author in his prologue when he speaks about his tales. But Boccaccio diminishes the overall presence of the plague in the Decameron to help the brigata gain the distance necessary to become invincible, to extinguish their fear of death. The Decameron does not engage, therefore, as I think you've understood well by this point, with the idea of the plague in an explicit way outside of these moments. Yet there are ways to read references to the death caused by the plague in these stories. One way I would offer is to attend to the characterization of empty spaces, as well as houses that are abandoned by their owners, as we read in the introduction to Day One. Places where one sees the apparitions of the recently departed, as in Pampinia's own words, but also as evoked from the excerpt, as we just saw, from Paul the Deacon's History of the Lombards. And here I'll just quickly scroll back. So this idea, right, that in abandoning the city, all of these wonderful homes obviously were left vacant, or they were taken over by animals. As we read in the introduction to day one, how great a number of splendid palaces, fine houses, and noble dwellings, once filled with retainers, with lords and with ladies, were bereft of all who had lived there, down to the tiniest child. Boccaccio must portray a Florence completely devastated by the plague, its streets filled with corpses, its houses emptied of its inhabitants, and the members of the brigata utterly abandoned by those who have already died or fled. Houses are, by nature, one's personal refuge from the elements, and they should also provide shelter and safety from external dangers and threats. And this is where we should be spending the majority of our time now during the days of COVID-19. But in the case of the Decameron, houses do not always keep out death in the time of a pandemic. Pampinia rejects the notion that they can return to their homes, saying, quote, "And if we return to our homes, what happens? I know not whether your experience is similar to mine, but my house was once full of servants, and now there is no one left apart from my maid and myself. I'm filled with foreboding and feel as if every hair of my head is standing on end. Wherever I go in the house, wherever I pause to rest, I seem to be haunted by the shades of the departed, whose faces no longer appear as I remember them, but with strange and horribly twisted expressions that frighten me out of my senses. Nor are homes inhabited by their owners amidst this exodus from the city. As we also learned from the introduction, but earlier on, people behaved as though their days were numbered and treated their belongings and their own persons with equal abandon. Hence, most houses had become common property, and any passing stranger could make himself at home as naturally as though he were the rightful owner. Houses become interchangeable with tombs in the 9th tale of the 6th day, the tale of Guido Cavalcanti and Betto Brunelleschi. Guido Cavalcanti avoids the threatening presence of Brunelleschi's brigata in the cemetery of Santa Reparata, offering the puzzling pronta risposta, gentlemen, in your own house, you may say whatever you like to me. Is Cavalcanti accusing the brigata of being like the freeloading squatters we just read about from the introduction to day one? No. Betto Brunelleschi clarifies, Cavalcanti is telling them that they are as good as dead since they are in a cemetery. Quote, "These tombs are the houses of the dead, that being the place where the dead are laid to rest and where they take up their abode. By describing it as our house, he wanted to show us that, by comparison with himself and other men of learning, all men who are as uncouth and unlettered as ourselves are worse off than dead, so that being in a graveyard, we are in our own house." It's not just a punchline to this tale. Le case dei morti, the houses of the dead, is a concept that frames the first tale of the 9th day. Yes, this is the first tale that follows the presentation of the brigata as invincible against death, with which we started. Filomena prefaces her story about Francesca, Rinuccio, and Alessandro thus: love not only leads lovers into diverse situations fraught with mortal peril, but will even induce them to enter the houses of the dead in the guise of corpses. That is, love causes one to abandon all fear of death and will even allow you to enter the houses of the dead, that is, tombs, disguised as the dead. While Filomena here is referring to a specific act that happens in the tale, in which one of them pretends to be dead and enters a tomb. I don't want to ruin the tale for you if you haven't read it. We should think back to Pampinia's words in the introduction. Is this a kind of narrative therapy for Pampinia's fear to return to her own home, which has become like the home of the dead? Does Filomena help Pampinia exercise that fear by means of her tale? So now I'm going to move on to the wonderful tales of the third day. If the brigata plays here with the spaces of death and life, and conveying in a sense that they're almost interchangeable, then they begin to do so much earlier than the ninth day, or even the sixth day. And for those of you interested in numbers, by the way, you might have noticed that we're moving from day 6 to day 9, back to day 3, 3 being, of course, right, the square root of 9, etc. So it's an interesting numerological fact for those of us who are engaged in that kind of work. But you're also going to notice here, more importantly, the reprisal of the theme of the houses of the dead. 2 tales in this day, the 4th and the 8th, attempt to bring the realms of the afterlife to this world. In Panfilo's tale, Puccio di Rinieri, who became a Franciscan friar late in life, he has a young wife, Isabetta, who, like the lady of the third tale, is unsatisfied with the constant fast that she has to endure with him, fasting being, of course, metaphorical. When Dom Felice, a conventual monk, becomes Friar Puccio's friend, he notices Isabetta's beauty and also her sexual dissatisfaction. How to get time alone with her in the same house as her husband, who never leaves home, who never leaves town? He convinces Puccio that the way to perform a ritualized penance is to lie still on a wood plank, extend his arms as if in crucifixion, and recite a litany all night until the bells ring for matins, at which point he can go to church and continue his prayers. His plan goes off with a hitch, and of course, he's able to consummate his love with Isabetta, who quips to Felice, in other words, Mr. Happy, "You make Friar Puccio do penance, but we are the ones who go to paradise." Or we might say they go to paradise while staying at home, an interesting spin on the trope of the houses of the dead. The 8th tale of the day does not place heaven on earth. Instead, it designs a purgatory on earth for a man named Ferrondo. A stupid man and a jealous husband, Ferrondo has a wife who complains about him to the abbot, an accomplished womanizer. The abbot, infatuated with Ferrondo's wife, comes up with a plan to get rid of Ferrondo, which she also approves. It involves having Ferrondo die and come back to life a better man. The abbot gives him a powder that knocks him out for 3 days, during which he is placed in a tomb, the house of the dead, and given up for dead by all who see his body. The abbot has Ferrondo moved to a vault, where once he wakes up, he's made to believe that he is in purgatory, and he receives lashings and scoldings from the abbot for his possessiveness and mistreatment of his wife. Ferrondo promises, "Oh, if I come back to life, I won't beat her anymore." The abbot, meanwhile, visits the wife regularly, disguised in Ferrondo's clothes, so none of the neighbors can actually suspect that something bad is happening. This whole affair carries on for 10 months until the wife becomes pregnant with the abbot's child. The abbot then lets Ferrondo come back to life, as it were, and he accepts this child, that is, Ferrondo accepts this child as a gift from God, naming him Benedict. If we move from heaven on earth in this tale, in the 4th tale, to purgatory on earth in the 8th tale, then we go to hell in the famous 10th tale of the day. And I'm sorry I don't have an image for this because I didn't find one that really conveyed the sense that I wanted to convey. Of course, everyone knows this tale, the most heavily censored of the Decameron. And in this tale, Alibek, a young girl, converts to Christianity and sets off on a life as a recluse in the desert. She's led to the monk Rustico, who tries to resist this temptation of this beautiful young girl, but eventually is overpowered by it. Claiming to teach her the best way to worship God, he decides to teach her how to put his devil back into her hell. So, to conclude, in these tales filled with references to the afterlife, the hypocrisy of the clergy is clearly put on display. But there's another issue at stake in all of these metaphors of sexual acts, and specifically by saying that hell, purgatory, and heaven are all places on this earth. The tales of day 3 spin erotic desires, the quest for invincibility and immortality, the possibility that love can conquer death. In a time in which death was present everywhere because of the plague, what greater way to overcome misfortune by finding ways to defy death itself? If the realms of the afterlife are on this earth, then perhaps death's sting is much less than we should fear. When one is motivated by love to overcome adverse fortune, one can dissolve the boundaries between life on this earth and the afterlife. As Zima in the 5th story of the 3rd day tells his beloved lady, "For if in the life thereafter people love as they do on earth, I shall love you forever." When the differences between this life and the next are erased and one can love forever, then death no longer has any power. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina Olson. Thank you very much. We really needed to touch base with Boccaccio.